Operational environments. They're described in many different ways, commonly in terms of logistics and communication, lines of effort, but there are more than one type of operational environment. You'll often hear things like linear and nonlinear, contiguous and non-contiguous, and then operational lines of effort versus lines of communication or lines of logistics. You will commonly hear that nonlinear, non-contiguous are unique to insurgency and counterinsurgency. And I think that that's a fair claim. They're not exclusive to it, but it certainly is where you commonly see these. Juxtapose that to two near peers fighting, high intensity conflict, and suddenly you start to see linear, contiguous with internal lines of effort, interior lines of effort rather, and interior lines of communication. Let's go to the board and start exploring a little bit of this. All right, Normandy, France, the invasion of, the Allied invasion of northern France. Let's start with that because I think that gives us a clear excellent example, the exemplar, right, of linear contiguous. So let's start with the term linear. Linear means one thing follows the next, right? So up here, I know I drew it a little goofy, but let's say that's England way up there, and they've massed on England. That is, the Allies have massed together for an attack. The Axis powers know this is coming, they can see it, but nonetheless can't do much about it. They're up there, they're massing for the attack. Of course, this leaves the Axis powers guessing where exactly is it going to be. Is it going to be Calais? Is it going to be in Normandy? Is it going to be somewhere else? But that is the next thing. First to mass, the next step is to gain entry. And as soon as you gain entry, the very next step is to create a toehold, a beachhead, right? You have to get into their area and defend this right away. One thing follows the next. If you're going to do a breakout and then push your lines farther, that would be the fourth step. You really have to do them sequentially. And this is called linear. One thing follows the next in the terms of the pacing and sequence of the operation. The next thing we're going to say is it's contiguous. And you know this word, the lower 48 contiguous states of the United States of America, right? It means they share a common border or boundary. Each unit that is, whatever this is, the Canadians here and the British here and the Americans there, whatever you have. The point is that they are contiguous. Their lines, their front lines, as well as even their rear operational areas, and this would be the operational rear, but their front lines are contiguous. So linear, contiguous. And because they're contiguous and this is linear, these arrows, these blue arrows marking here, this shows lines of communication, LOC. LOC is your, not just your communication, but in fact your logistics as well. So there's your lines of communication. It also shows lines of effort. What are you trying to do? LOE. So LOC, LOE, and they are interior to the toehold, to their region, behind the contiguous line. Now let's look at that from the Axis power side, right? We've got the Germans out here going, okay, we've got to, attack the Allies and kick them off the beach. Well, that's just it. They have a concentric, that is, they focus on one thing, that they're coming together, one line of effort, a concentric line of effort. You see, they're trying to break through the enemy's defenses somewhere and then push them back to this one area. So they have a coming together, a concentric line of effort for the enemy. Whereas these they're looking for a break out of their lines, and that's eccentric. So you hear eccentric lines of effort and concentric lines of effort. And that's how it is. Now, you often hear tie goes to the runner, right? Defense is the strongest. And you can see that because their lines of communication, at least initially, their lines of communication, lines of logistics, they're very short. Furthermore, they're massed together themselves, so as the enemy breaks through, it's easier for them to respond, and even if they do successfully break through, to thwart them, to block them and keep them from massing together and having a strong effect. We often talk about the strength of the defense, and we don't go into great detail. This really starts to show, at least at an operational level, why, once again, the defense is generally regarded as the stronger of the two, defense or offense. But again, this is very linear in its operational flow, and it's contiguous because it's all tied together nice and neatly with great command and control and logistics and lines of effort back here. What does nonlinear, non-contiguous look like? All right, let's discuss that. So let's talk about an example with non-contiguous, non-linear operations. Guerrilla warfare and insurgencies are as old as time. I mean, arguably they stretch back to the days of Alexander the Great, if not significantly earlier than that. But America's first foray, though America itself was born by an insurgency and guerrilla warfare, and then it struggled mightily with the Native American Indians, and this can all be seen in that, very much seen in that light. America as a projected force, as a projected power, first matures its understanding of how to conduct counterinsurgency in the Philippine War, in the Spanish-American War that very much saw America embroiled in battles and wars for 20 years in the Philippines. In that, you have to understand, let's talk about nonlinear. I think it's actually, it might have been better to call it multilinear rather than nonlinear, but no one says multilinear, and nonlinear is the term. And what it means is this. Really, you stop to think about it. You can use any of the acronyms out there, PMISI and whatnot. I tend to think of it in the more simplest terms, which is DIME, diplomacy, information, military, and economic. In the Philippines, you have Christians warring against Muslims and vice versa. You have one political group warring against another political group, and there's actually, that's not just, left and right. There's multiple different groups that have formed over different periods of time, and frankly different invading and governing powers, from Portugal and Spain to the to the United States of America, and then later Japan. But this is all well before Japan shows up for World War II. This is 40 years earlier. The point is that you have all these different lines of effort, right? And it's not linear, because in a sense it is. You still can say, well, in order to achieve X, we must first achieve Y. But because it's saying, well, hold on, I might team up with this group, a religious group, because I agree with their affiliation. Or even if I disagree with their affiliation, they're warring against and weakening my political group or my economic group enemy, so that you say, oh, okay, hold on, whew, that's a tangled web there. So if your otherwise enemy is conducting operations that weaken your primary enemy, then you might team up with your lesser enemy to have a greater effect. And so this is why it's not necessarily a this follows that in terms of operational planning. It still is sequential because, at least as far as we know, human life is sequential, right? At least we perceive it as sequential. And so certainly you can say, well, one thing gives rise to another, and cause and effect, right? My point here is that for planning, it may not look anything like that, because you are waging lines of effort across so many different spectrums. Think about, I say diplomacy, information, military, and economic. Well, where does terrorism fit in there? I mean, terrorism is a form of communication. It is a militant act, but it's a form of communication, and so it can be used in any of those. Let me give you an example that the normative practice, when a grievance turns to an insurgency, what's the normative practice then is that violence initially starts with violence against property, specifically economic assets. And it's to try to say, hey, I'm willing to use violence if you don't come to the table and solve this grievance that I have. So that's what typically it happens. It's more of an economic device in its early inception. But what happens then, of course, is very typically the ruling government overreacts and starts killing the terrorists, killing human lives, and this is a spiral down as it polarizes society, and both gain sympathies and recruits because of it, right? You can see what starts as a economic form of influence winds up being a militant form of influence, and then maybe diplomatic, because it can go legal as well, right? So it's got lots of pieces there. If you're wrapping your head around that, this is what we mean by nonlinear. It's not necessarily that we planned these series of events, but we're planning multiple lines of effort that can feed off of each other and take hard and left-right turns. Well, but it's also non-contiguous. You see, this AO over here, let's say this is the Americans over here, and they're caught in a point where people are waging maybe a religious war over here. And this one over here, this is on the coast, and it's an economic fight over here. And this one down here, well, this is near the Capitol, and it's three different parties trying to seize power. And only one of them, the Americans recognize as legitimate power. And so what you've got is completely different areas of operations that are not, often the case, are not sharing a common border, so they are non-contiguous. And once again, the planning of operations is non-linear. So you see that the lines of communication, these are not internal anymore. Certainly there are interior lines of communication to support your own area of operations. Now that still holds true if your forces are located all over here and you're doing logistics and communications and efforts. Those are interior lines of communication, lines of effort. But you also have exterior as you're going and working with other allies in the area. And we say these are exterior because, of course, you don't control that area. That area is either fairly neutral or even controlled by the enemy. So those are exterior lines of communication. Lines of communication. Remember, logistics flows with that. And then here, if it's trying to push out, so this AO is trying to expand its influence, and so it has exterior lines of effort. That is, they're somehow conducting operations against this group, this hostile group out there. I specifically used this because the Philippines gives us a really good study, historic study, of America's involvement there. It gives us a really good study of how the Americans came to understand counterinsurgency, and certainly we've been in one counterinsurgency after another over the last 120 years. But this was the early onset of us projecting our forces to a foreign military and a foreign region and having to deal with an insurgency and guerrilla warfare. This really starts to say, oh, okay, hold on. There are contiguous operations that are very, very linear, and there are non-contiguous operations that are not linear at all. And so that's it in a nutshell. We'll continue using these terms, but I wanted to make sure we were definitely talking about these terms before I leap forward and just assume everybody has a good grasp on that, right? Thank you. Appreciate it.